Okay, of all the different features of your car, more important than the power of your engine or maybe even the actual brakes of your car, your seatbelt is perhaps the one thing that could make the difference between life and death. And in a sense, when it comes to navigating complex conflicts, the same is true for your marriage as well. Having a basic safety harness can be the difference between your marriage thriving and ending up on life support. This last and final section of your chapter focuses on what that safety harness looks like in marriage and how to use it. In this section, we're going to cover 5 things that are absolutely critical to have if you want to be able to get into and out of complex and hotly charged issues in your marriage. So that no matter how bad things get and how hard your marriage feels like, you'll always have your basic 5-point safety harness to fall back on. Now, before I get into each of these, it helps to think of them kind of like mindsets, postures that help to set you up best for conflicts with your spouse. So even though you might not be able to have any control over what your spouse does or says, you can at least have control over your posture and mindset going into conflicts with your spouse. Okay, let me go ahead and unpack what each of these look like right now. The first posture is pre-forgiveness. And what I mean by pre-forgiveness is being able to forgive your spouse before you even engage them in a fight or say a word to them, and without them ever having to say that they're sorry or admitting wrong. So essentially, you have to be willing to walk into a fight already having forgiven them. Now, I know that might sound crazy, but really, this could be a complete game changer for your conflicts. You see, if you hold on to forgiveness within your heart and in your posture, then you're much more likely to be able to find reconciliation and resolution. And conversely, if you hold on to anger and resentment in your heart and you're waiting for them to do something to take that resentment away, then you're much more likely to find that nothing that your spouse does or says will ever seem to make things right for you. If you're waiting for your spouse to do something before you're willing to forgive them, then ultimately they have power over you to dictate how long you're going to have to hold on to that poison of bitterness. You don't control how long you suffer from anger, they do. And so long as that's the case, it ends up with you being the one that suffers more than anyone else. So the objective here is to learn how to work your way to forgiving your spouse because A, it sets you up for the best possible way to reconcile with them, and B, it prevents you from holding on to anger that ends up causing more damage to you than anyone else. But at this point, it's really important to make some distinctions between what it means to forgive versus reconcile. Pre-forgiving your spouse doesn't mean reconciling with them. Reconciling means making everything right. And in order to make things right, you're going to need your spouse to do and say a few things. Now, those things we'll get into more specifically when we cover reconciling hurts in part 3 of this course. For now, though, all you need to know for this posture is that it's on you to take the first step of forgiving. Forgiving takes only one person to do, and that's you. Reconciling, on the other hand, that takes 2 people, you and your spouse. Now, there are a few analogies that I find are helpful for couples so that they can understand how to make this distinction. First, it's a lot like understanding how debt reconciliation and bankruptcy works. You see, when a lender accepts a declaration of bankruptcy from a borrower, they're essentially saying that the debt that's owed to them is forgiven. The lender has to forgive the debt and wipe the debt off their books. But in order to continue the relationship and to restore the relationship, the borrower has to rebuild credit. There are things that the borrower has to do for up to 7 years in order to demonstrate that they're trustworthy again. So while reconciliation of debt wouldn't be possible without the lender offering forgiveness of that debt first, forgiveness alone isn't enough to restore trust and to reconcile the relationship. You have control to forgive and make reconciliation possible, but your spouse has partial control to actually reconcile and make things right again. Another way to understand this is to think of it like having a meal with your spouse. To have a meal together means to reconcile and to rebuild trust again. You're literally breaking bread together and saying, you know what, I'm good with you, you're good with me. Now the problem is if you don't pre-forgive your spouse, then you're not even sitting at the table. You haven't invited them to join you, you haven't set the table or brought your own ingredients to the table. But if you can pre-forgive without them having to do anything on their end, you've essentially prepared the table and have invited them to bring their ingredients so that you can make reconciliation happen together. But for true reconciliation to happen, they have to come to the table and bring their own ingredients too. Without them doing their work, no rebuilding or mending of the relationship can happen. But by forgiving them in advance, you've done everything that you can to make it possible for the next step of reconciliation to happen. Now, if they can't or won't come to the table and offer their half of the ingredients, then that'll be on them. At the very least, you won't be left having to hold on to bitterness and resentment, knowing that you've done everything that you can and have let the ball in their court to mend fences. Pre-forgiving is an incredibly hard thing to do, and it takes intentionality and strength to do it, not just once, but over and over again. But if you can integrate this part of your posture, then you'll be able to withstand some of the harshest and the most difficult challenges that you might ever face in your marriage. Now, the second posture is having a catalyst and modeling mindset. Being a catalyst means thinking of yourself as the sole instigator for change, meaning you have to accept that positive change might not ever happen in your marriage unless you change something about yourself and what you do. Or to think about it another way, if you're waiting for your spouse to change or to do something, then not only will change never happen, but you'll be completely powerless and stuck in the same cycle without any ability to do anything about it. To be a catalyst means that you take on the mantle of ownership and leadership, regardless of whether you think your spouse should take on that responsibility for themselves. You have to see yourself as the front runner to spark change and to model something different or better. One of the things I tell my clients is that it only takes one person to change the way a relationship works. It's easier if both people are willing to change, for sure, but you only need one. And many times, once you start saying and doing things differently, you begin to model for your spouse what the new expectations are for healthy communication and how you're going to treat one another. See, once you set the bar, you leave it up to your spouse to adjust to that new bar and the standard that you've set. Okay, the third posture is self-awareness and accountability. You see, in conflict, it's really easy to focus on what your spouse is doing or isn't doing. It's a lot harder to focus on yourself first, and that's what this posture serves as a reminder to do. It's a reminder that there are things about you that you're probably not aware of. Things that, if not for your spouse being there to push into you and to start fights with you, you might not ever really notice. I always tell people that if I wasn't married, I'd have a lot less strain and pain and conflict in my life, but I'd also be a much lesser and more immature version of myself too. So it's easy to focus on your spouse's faults, but the point of this posture is to get you to focus first and primarily on yourself and to hold yourself accountable for the things that you have to grow in and to work on in life. In the end, if you prioritize becoming a stronger and more mature person over something as important or as urgent as resolving your conflicts, you'll stand a much better chance of actually resolving your conflicts and growing as a person as well. Okay, the fourth posture is relentless introspection and inner curiosity. Really, this one is a continuation of that last posture. If that last posture of self-awareness and accountability challenges you to accept that you have faults that need to be discovered, this posture of introspection and inward curiosity challenges you to really be interested in knowing and understanding what those faults are, and to, in a sense, always be thinking of yourself as a puzzle to be figured out and understood. And really, it starts with the belief that you're never really done growing or discovering yourself, that there's always more ways for you to learn about yourself and to grow. From there, it moves to constantly being curious about why you do what you do, why you think what you think, and why you feel what you feel. It helps if you shift your perception of conflict. If you think of conflict less about figuring out who's right and wrong, and more about it as something that forces you to ask better questions about yourself and to understand yourself better, then you can start approaching conflicts as opportunities to grow and to mature. And really, it starts with the belief that you're never done growing or discovering yourself, that there's always more ways for you to learn about yourself and to grow yourself. And from there, it moves to constantly being curious about why you do what you do, why you think what you think, and why you feel what you feel. You see, it helps to shift your perception of what conflict is about. If you think of conflict less about trying to figure out who's right and wrong, and more about it as something that forces you to ask better questions of yourself and to understand yourself better, then you can start approaching conflicts as opportunities to grow and to mature. But if you ever find yourself in the position where you feel like you don't ever need to grow or to change anymore in life, then just be aware. There's a good chance that you're setting yourself up and your marriage for failure in the long run. All right, the last posture is positive regard and compassionate curiosity. Now, the idea here is in order to start your conflicts off on the best foot possible, you have to, at best, see your spouse through a positive lens, or at worst, as someone that's working through their own issues and expressing pain and hurt in maybe some misguided ways. To see them with positive regard means offering them the benefit of the doubt, to not assume the worst but the best about them. But if that's too difficult or too much of a stretch for your imagination, then at the very least you have to see what they do as ways of dealing with and coping with pain and hurt in their life. That doesn't mean that you have to think that what they're doing is healthy by any means, just that what they're doing today, how they act or speak, is simply their best attempt at dealing with various issues in their life today and in their past. It might help to make some distinctions in how you see your spouse. Having positive regard might mean just seeing them as having good character and the best of intentions, but someone that does things that don't always reflect that good character or intention. That sometimes they do unhealthy things that don't align with their character because they don't have better coping or communication skills yet. If you can move your perception of your spouse to this vantage point, then you can find more patience when you consider that your spouse is just trying, maybe not always in the best way, but trying to learn and cope better in life. Having positive regard allows you to create more space in your heart for compassion and patience as you work to improve your communication and your relationship. This leads to the second part of the posture, which is compassionate curiosity. If you can see your spouse with a positive lens first, or as a hurting person that's saying or doing hurtful things, then you can respond to them more easily with compassion and patience. And from there, to pursue trying to understand them and really to help challenge them to understand themselves better and their own pain better as well. The key here is that it needs to come from a place and posture of compassion and patience and tenderness. All right, so to recap here, the idea behind these 5 postures is to help put power back into your hands. So many of the reasons why fights go bad in marriage is because each spouse is depending on the other person to make the move first or to do something to make things better. But so long as that's the case, power to change and heal your marriage will always rest in the hands of someone other than yourself. So regardless of what your spouse is doing or not doing, you now have a safety belt to keep your fights safe and constructive going forward and into the future. Okay, that's it for not only this chapter that introduced you to some safety procedures for your fights, but that's also it for part 2 of this course. In part 2, even though it was quite a bit more tactical with a lot of terms and definitions, it was meant to give you a structure to navigate your conflicts better and to give you kind of a sort of a map or direction to help you increase your chances of getting to resolution, while at the same time reducing your chances of getting stuck in that bad fighting loop. So putting all the pieces together a little bit better here, part 1 introduced you to your car and some essential skills for driving through conflict. Part 2 gave you road rules and structure. In the next and last part of this course, part 3, I'll introduce you to ways to navigate the most often used and complex kinds of conflicts that you're going to have to use in marriage. And that'll be how to handle alignment lane and hurt lane conversations. Again, remember to go through the workbook exercises to really cement your learning here. I know there's a lot to take in, but again, the more practice you get in and the more you do things like the exercises that are laid out for you in the workbook, the easier and more natural it'll become. And as always, feel free to reach out to us at the Watershed Initiative to get connected with a coach or counselor to get more personalized and guided help. All right, folks, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video when we take on part 3 of this course.